the intersection between like human behavior and applied technologies to me is beautiful because humans are at the center and kind of core of every societal system. So many times people assume that AI agents have to have large language models, and they don't. They can be composed of any number of machine learning outputs or any number of algorithms as their reasoning center, but they don't have to. It's such an interesting and evolving breakthrough technology that I think a lot of people are really interested in how it's going to kind of shape out. Sometimes we can get so wrapped around the idea of the new that we don't really know what the new is going to do for us. It's just new. I think that's one of the most exciting things about AI agents is that it's functional AI. It's AI that can do things for you. You know, so much of AI is fantastic at predicting, at giving you data, at giving you good information. One of the clearest lessons for me is that technical excellence only gets you so far. It doesn't mean anything if it doesn't map to real business outcomes. So often you build this really shiny, cool thing, and it's a really shiny, cool thing, and it does all this really cool stuff. But if it doesn't actually move the bottom line for the business, if it doesn't actually provide a real world outcome for the business, it just gets lost in the shuffle.
Today on Atomic Conversations, we are joined by Hanah Mary Darley, co-founder and chief AI officer at Geodi. Hanah has spent over a decade at the intersection of technology, psychology, and strategy, from leading threat research and AI strategy at Darktrace to now helping enterprises adopt Agentic AI in a secure and governed way. Her unique background, spanning government intelligence, cybersecurity, and product leadership, gives her a rare perspective on how CIOs and IT leaders can navigate AI-driven digital transformations. Welcome to the podcast, Hanah.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
One way in which I want to start is I made you sound like, a very female John Le Carre with intelligence and a lot of enigma there. Can you go for a bit on your career itself, Hanah? How did you get started in this and how did you get here?
Yeah, sure. So often when people talk about my background in government intelligence, people think of kind of James Bond. But I always say, it's kind of like an astronaut. It sounds really cool, but then you drive into work every day and you say, oh, what does your day look like? Well, I sit in the sphere and I spin for about 12 hours. So I basically just worked in a building, but I'm happy to be hyped up. So my start was in government. I started work quite young. And I basically worked through just about a decade of government intelligence, which was a very rich, rewarding start. But it really taught me the value of data and hypothesis testing, really having to understand your sourcing and why you think something and really challenging assumptions and critical thinking. And that was all really formative to kind of how I moved through the rest of my career. And there's a lot of interesting stuff within that, but I kind of brought all of that into my time at Darktrace. So I was there for a few years and it was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. It's such a cool company, but I really got to explore the intersection of AI and cybersecurity, which I think is just fascinating. And especially I have a psychological background, as you said, and the intersection between like human behavior and applied technologies to me is so beautiful because humans are at the center and kind of core of every societal system. So that's a little bit about my background. I don't actually know if I've answered your question, but that's a little bit about what got me here.
No, I think you certainly have, Hanah. One of the things about IT in that we've interviewed now like a lot of people for the podcast, and we've seen this constantly in that the most interesting work, in AI and IT is being done by people who've not, come at it straight. They have come at it from, an angle, and there's usually, and it's funny because at least another female leader, Aisha Khan, whom we interviewed, also came from a cybersecurity background, right? And she's a CIO of Treasure Data, if I remember right. And uh, especially cybersecurity as well as a bunch of other adjacencies. I think the the the, the more people are exposed to a bunch of these things, the better they are in actually implementing AI and working in IT. So I really wanted to get into this, but you're currently focused on helping enterprises adopt agentic AI in a secure and governed way, right? I took that off your LinkedIn. But how do you define agentic AI?
Well, like everything else in our security industry, we have about 15 different definitions for the same thing, and we are constantly going to use all 15 of them. The way that we're starting to define it is really simply a large language model that's equipped with tools. Now, naturally, they'll often have memory. They'll often have additional knowledge bases. Ideally, they'll have self-improvement capability. Part of the reasoning will have planning. But if you really drill down to what's the minimum requirement for what makes an agent, It would be large language model with tools. And so I think it's really interesting as well because a lot of people are evolving through this space and finding this definition for themselves. I mean, so many times people assume that AI agents have to have large language models and they don't. They can be composed of any number of machine learning outputs or any number of algorithms. They often have large language models as their reasoning center, but they don't have to. But it's such an interesting and evolving breakthrough technology that I think a lot of people are really interested in how it's going to kind of shape out.
Yeah, that makes sense because like this is also something we are saying, we are trying to define it, and we are seeing it being defined in sort of almost the same way as you are. But like coming from your perspective, what are the sort of like governance challenges that you think IT leaders should be like very aware of when thinking about this?
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things about being an IT leader, especially if you're tasked with enabling innovation, is that you're asked to go really quickly, which means that you almost never have time to govern what you're trying to enable. And so it's this constant tension between kind of innovation and speed. And I think a lot of times it's kind of pitched as an either or, but I think it's never going to be that if you want it to scale well. I think you have to be able to wrap governance from the beginning. Actually, one of the things that I see a lot of IT and security leaders struggle with is just the basic visibility, knowing what you have. I mean, it's a constant security struggle, and it's definitely transposed itself into AI agents. But as the business asks to do AI rollouts, as the business asks you to hit certain targets for AI adoption, there's often this kind of lag between knowing even what the business is experimenting with or knowing what they're bringing on board. And it's so difficult sometimes for security and IT leaders who are busy, busy people to have the ability to take time to identify what the business is doing, to have any sort of metrics around that that are meaningful. And then to map that back to kind of a timeline, because most of the time you're dealing with like project rollouts. You've done some sort of vendor risk assessment, you have a project timeline, but you don't necessarily know exactly what systems that entails outside of a change request. You don't know the full scope of what's possible with that AI approach or with that AI, especially agent.
So is that the biggest thing that you're seeing in conversations with IT leaders, in the sense that they are like, what else are you seeing?
I think one of the things that we see all the time is that security and IT leaders are so important to enabling the business, but they're not always at the decision making center of how AI adoption happens. And that can be a real big hang up because actually they're such an asset. They're such a resource to help you because they have probably the most experience deploying technology across the organization. And so it's about, I think, helping them to be strategic and understand enough that they can communicate with the business what the potential of something is beyond just kind of a cyber threat, because often the business can kind of tune out at cyber threat unless it's happening. And so it's giving them more colorful information. It's giving them capabilities. It's giving them a lot more data driven ideas and conversations. And I think one of the things that's unique about this period is that you actually have the potential to wrap governance from the beginning. Most of the time, security and IT leaders are sort of having to retrofit something onto an existing problem. They're having to say, okay, I already have all of this. I now need to wrap some sort of framework or policy or tool around it to make it safe, whereby as you're doing AI agent adoption now, you have the ability to really start from a secure space, to start from a governance by design space. And I think that, one of the key challenges you said that we're seeing all the time is that you're being asked to go quickly and you feel like you're not going quickly enough, and everybody feels that. And so you have to almost check yourself and say, actually, even if it takes a week longer, it will be worth it in the scale up because it won't scale if it's not governed. So what you'll have is short-term success and then long-term lag, and eventually you'll give up on the projects.
Yeah, like this is fascinating because even like, we've had like more conversations earlier this year on the podcast, and we had this like theme repeat in which CIO said exactly the same thing, that they know what they know what they need to do. But in the absence of frameworks that they have relied upon for like years, they've had to come up with their own. And therefore, when they're not at the decision making table, it becomes very difficult for them to communicate that properly, right? And it's very funny because my next question was actually what I wrote down was about frameworks. Like, do you have any frameworks like, for them to sort of achieve this balance? Like, it could be like three, it could be five, like, go for it.
Yeah, I think the first thing to start with before you even go to framework is that AI is not traditional software. And so if you're trying to wrap frameworks that are designed for traditional software around it, you're always going to find this ill fit. There's always going to be this gap. And it can be really frustrating because you're trying to fit it into the processes that you have, whether that's from the risk side, whether that's vendor risk management, whether that's software procurement. There's so many different kind of existing corporate phases that businesses have to hopefully flush out any likely problems. But agents are non-deterministic. So and they're decision makers, they're operators. So they're going to be really different in practice than a software that you can sort of test and you know the capability and outcome of on day one. It really has to go beyond that for AI agents. So in terms of frameworks, I think obviously, some of the most helpful are ones that are designed around AI systems. So, a lot of people that we talk to are getting ISO 42001. A lot of people are talking about the OWASP standards because they've just shifted from just large language model to agentic coverage. And there's also a lot of good information in NIST and, of course, the EU AI Act. I think the struggle that a lot of people have is that all these frameworks are designed for broader AI systems that you then have to narrow to your specific use case. And often it goes back to that problem of observability. They don't know exactly what they have. They don't know exactly what it's capable of. So trying to govern it, you're almost in a chicken or the egg situation where you're trying to figure out what you have so that you can govern it, but you're trying to govern it so that you can figure out what you have. And it's this really difficult tension. And I think it has to start with you need that observability and clarity because sometimes when we talk about visibility, it's just visibility. It doesn't necessarily imply understanding. So, having insight into what you have, if you have no meaning attached to it, is not that much more helpful. It's slightly more helpful, but it's not all the way helpful. So, there's tons of different frameworks, but I think what we're seeing across the board is that most IT and security leaders are creating a combination, which is going to be the most effective because every business operates slightly differently in slightly different regulatory environments and also with slightly different user needs. Some experimentation is okay in some businesses, and in some businesses, it's like, that is not okay. We don't want that much experimentation. We're very risk averse. So I think trying to create a copy paste framework is a mistake. I think creating standards that people can rally around and then use as their own customizable frameworks is the best long term.
Yeah. Is this one of the reasons that CIOs are struggling to innovate? And like I know I'm making a leading statement there, but like one thing that we are coming back on is that um, CIOs want new tools, they want to adopt AI, but in the absence of like oversight, and as you say, the controls that they are very used to, I don't think they're that comfortable. And that sort of like reflects in how fast they are able to adopt. Is that something you're seeing as well?
I think there's a modern fallacy that kind of security and IT leaders constantly want to say no to the business, and the reality is they're left with risk, and so they're trying to keep the business safe. So it's not so much that they don't want to be innovative, they don't want to be cutting edge, they do, but they also don't want to throw the guardrails out the window and say, whatever goes, laissez-faire, we'll just let things happen, and because then it's going to come back on them. So it's going to come back to them to remediate when something goes awry. So I think, yeah, the operational idea that ultimately security leaders want to say no and they're just trying to block the business from doing things and going faster. I think that's so wrong. All the security and IT leaders that I talk to are really interested in saying yes to the business, but they want to do that in a controlled way. They want to do that in a way in which they prepare themselves for an audit. They want to do that in a way in which it enables them to not just have sort of tick box compliance, but really have an understanding of what systems they're using because there's already system complexity. I mean, what happens with AI doesn't happen in a vacuum. All of this is coming across existing system complexity across cloud, across identity, across email, across all these different surfaces where there's still siloed data problems and there's still trouble consolidating into one view. I mean, how many single panes of glass have we been pitched over the last 10 years that are pulling everything together? Even in a scene, you don't have all the data. There's still pieces that you have to go investigate individually. So I think another common kind of area of confusion is that security leaders are operating at this optimum level and they have all the insight they need and they're just being kind of overly cautious and they just want more. It's like, no, they have tons of instability and uncertainty now. And so layering complex systems on top of that, like Lego, is not something to be done lightly. And they're very rightly trying to reconcile between the need for auditable, traceable, observable systems whilst also saying yes to the business and enabling their objectives to go forward.
I loved how you touched upon like, what a model looks like and what its real world implementation look like, right? Looks like, right? So, um, this is a question I wanted to like specifically put to you. How do you handle the trade off between explainable AI and high performing models, right? And I think this is also like these high performing models, they operate like black boxes, and CIOs love being able to explain that this product works like this, and this is what's going to happen. This is what it looks like. Here's a flow chart, right? But when we don't know, you know, like how do they handle the trade off, and how do you like, how do you tell them to do so?
I think the short, hard truth is that performance without reliability doesn't scale. So the real answer is eventually explainability is a table stakes. It's got to be in there. But I think so often you can kind of get wrapped around what explainability means. Explainability is a good principle from an AI perspective. If you're looking at machine learning, it's a great way to validate your outputs. It's a great way to make sure that your algorithms are kind of working as expected. When you talk about AI agents, what you're really thinking about is reasoning. You're talking about how did the agent arrive at a conclusion? And that's super valuable. And I think that that has to be kind of baked into systems. But this is an evolving space. So in the interim, obviously, eventually, you kind of want almost a regulatory demands for explainability. And that really is valuable from a systems perspective. But in the interim, while these systems are evolving, you may not actually need to know what the reasoning is in the model if you have agentic behavioral explainability. So explainability has such a specific term with the industry. I always want to talk about kind of clarity or understanding or observability. But really the key is when you're talking about kind of scaling agentic operations, you need to know what the agent did, what hopefully you have some sort of intent picture as to maybe why that happened. You have the instructions, you have some sort of additional context, and obviously the impact, because that's the real kind of key trifecta of what you need to understand. Everything else can be helpful, but it's a little bit like when you do root cause analysis. It's always helpful to understand why you were targeted, but it probably isn't essential to getting your systems back online. It's not something that's necessarily going to completely move the goalpost between having safe systems that are back and operational versus having systems that are still potentially vulnerable. So I think it's more about have you isolated what happened, what went wrong, and which systems are affected. And so that to me, the behavioral explainability is more important, especially in the near and kind of medium term, than is model explainability from an enterprise perspective. I still think, again, that explainability from an AI systems soundness perspective is a table stakes. But I think from an enterprise perspective, it will take the market a while to get there. So in the interim, it's about behavior.
Yeah, I love that answer, Hannah. Like I've tried to read up about this, and this is the best sort of explanation I've like listened to. So thank you. I think our listeners will really enjoy it. So before I go to the next question, I wrote like two quotes that I think are really good from what you've spoken of until now. One thing you said was that AI is not traditional software, and we shouldn't treat it as such, right? This is important, and I'm gonna like reuse this as a lead somewhere. The other thing you said was performance without reliability doesn't scale, right? And we keep, especially for example, I'm the head of marketing. So I go to my IT head and I'm constantly saying, hey, I want like, I don't know, granola, I want this, I want that. Why aren't you letting me buy this software?
Why?
Yeah, this AI is useful, like give it to my team, and like in general, marketing teams are like early adopters. Like we go after stuff. We love using new things.
You're creative, no?
Yeah, exactly. Like, that's what I told them. But anyway, so when we come back to this, like I think also like people like me and my team, like who are asking for this, we also need to understand what you said, that performance without reliability won't scale. And my head of IT is also thinking, okay, like I'm going to give this to these chaps here and they're going to work with it. But like, what if, this doesn't scale to the point where I don't have the explainability. I don't know where the data is going. Like, is it like integrating well with things that I already have? And so like, I think we also have to like look at it from that angle. Thank you. Like I think you made that clear.
And I see this all the time from AI projects. So when you look at applied AI, so often the art of the possible is so exciting and interesting. So we could do this new thing, we could try this, we could change this, and it's so creative and exciting. But I always come back to Jevon's paradox. I don't know if you know it, but I'm not a physicist, so this is my one moonlight opportunity to pretend I am. So around the kind of turn of the century, English coal production, they were going through and they realized, people weren't wanting to mine anymore. It wasn't super safe. And they were running low on coal, which obviously powered the Industrial Revolution, was such a vital resource. And so they said, okay, well, we've got to put in place efficiency measures, else we'll run out of coal. So they studied all the efficiency measures over a number of years. And at the end of the studies, they found out that they used more coal with the efficiency measures than they did beforehand. And so it's this important paradox that so often happens, especially in AI, because it's exciting, it's the potential of something new. But if you don't have a real core problem that you're solving, if you don't have a really clear way that this is going to help your team, that this is going to empower people to do different things or help them do things better or help them do things more things in a really concrete way beyond just they could possibly be more productive, you can run into this trap where you end up being less efficient because you're trying to be so efficient. And it's such an important reminder as, just business people. So outside of just security and IT leaders, but just teams that are operating in business, sometimes we can get so wrapped around the idea of the new that we don't really know what the new is going to do for us. It's just new. And so I think that's one of the most exciting things about AI agents is that it's functional AI. It's AI that can do things for you. So much of AI is fantastic at predicting, at giving you data, at giving you good information. But this is actually AI that can go out and do something in the real world. It's functional. But it still has to solve a problem. Otherwise, you'll end up being disappointed. It's the cliff of disillusionment. You'll get really excited about all the things it's going to do for you. But if it's not aligned to a problem, if it's not really helping you with something that you really need to do that's new or something that you're trying to revamp, then you'll kind of be disappointed with the results.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. Like I'm writing down another one of your terms, like cliff of disillusionment. Like I think I'll use it
Yeah.
somewhere. Before I go to the next question, like what was the paradox called, Hannah? Like
Laban's paradox.
here's a question that I had written down before. What common pitfalls do you see enterprises fall into while adopting AI? And I think like this is the most pertinent question I can ask you because you're helping them do this. Literally. Um, and like how can IT leaders avoid the most you know the most common ones from day one?
I think the most common one is what I talked about with the problem statement. Really often, even in security and IT, we get advertised so much tech that we're like, new is always better, And so there's all this stuff that we could bring in that could, make our lives better, do our dishes, all sorts of things. But does it actually solve a near-term problem for you? Or maybe a long-term problem if you have it really well scoped? But always for me, I I hear about these circular conversations from security and IT leaders where we have to adopt AI because we have to adopt AI, but there's no real like granular problem that we're trying to solve, which often leads to a bad problem solution fit. Because if you don't have a clear problem that you're trying to solve, then you'll bring in something, but maybe not something that's valuable. For example, if you're just trying to get better predictive data, you may not need an AI agent. You might need a machine learning algorithm. Vice versa, if you want the AI to go do something, then no amount of interesting RAG systems, large language models, or machine learning by itself is going to help you without some sort of functional operational component. It has to be able to go and act on your behalf. But that comes with delegated decision making. And so often we disconnect those two. And it's just the tool will go do something rather than the tool is empowered to make decisions. So it's a lot more like a human user than it is like software. And so it's really important that you understand what the core problem is that you're trying to solve. And I found that that can be really helpful with business conversations as well. So with the marketing team who want to get fancy new software, it's going to be super exciting. Maybe you want Writer to help you create some amazing content. They do incredible work. What problem are you solving? Do you not have enough content? Do you have too much content, but it's not very focused? Do you want more types of multimodal content? What are you trying to achieve out of it? Because so often without that, you end up with these kind of hazy project goals and timelines, and you almost never have good success metrics. I think the other piece that kind of tends to happen is that we don't always factor in human behavior, and humans love to experiment. I think the idea that your business isn't experimenting with AI agents is probably a fallacy. I think for the most part, you can expect whether it's coding agents, whether it's a Copilot license, whether it's something that's very benign and simple that they're building themselves. I think the idea that no one's using AI if we haven't directed them to use AI yet is a little bit of a fallacy. And so one of the things that I've seen a lot is kind of what gives rise to shadow AI, which is this experimentation that goes kind of unchecked because we don't expect humans to operate outside of their explicit directives. This is the this is the policy, and so you kind of plan for a perfect user, but you can't really do that. And especially with AI, you can't plan for perfect users. So the acceptable use policy is only so helpful if you don't have caution it's hot kind of warnings in it. We have to be warned that a drink is hot because someone somewhere has stuck their finger in a coffee. And so you think through, well, nobody would do that, but someone would. So you almost have to go super, super granular in these acceptable use policies, which can then make them unpalatable for the business. Because you're like, well, listen, I'm not going to tell you every click I make, like, get real. And so you end up with these kind of silos where people are experimenting by themselves or they're experimenting in small systems. And eventually it might bubble up to the business, but that might only be when something goes wrong. And so it often lacks security oversight. It often lacks context. And with good intentions, they're trying to be innovative. They're trying to be cutting edge. They're trying to optimize their operations. But this idea that the business moving fast and security will catch up, it often leads to shadow AI, where you have a bunch of systems that IT leaders don't have any sort of insight around or auditable trails for. And then you get caught out when you have an audit, a cyber insurance renewal, a framework that you have to comply with that you didn't previously have to comply with. So I think one of the things that we always hear really innovative IT leaders and security leaders talk about is establishing a culture of like safe experimentation, establishing safe places where employees can build out ideas, whether that's purchasing something and running a POC or whether that's building something themselves, if they're, a vibe coder or a citizen developer, all the way through to a really technical person. But I think, one of the kind of cautionary tales that we've heard a lot about is that there's still a lot of coding that goes into AI agents even now. So one of the things that most of the security and IT leaders that we talk to constantly say to us is, this is a lot more technical than we thought it was going to be for off the shelf. It's important that you have that idea of experimentation woven into your culture in a way in which is safe. If you're in financial services, for example, you have really, really strict regulatory overhead. So what that looks like will be really different than what it looks like in ad tech. But you still have ways of creating safe spaces, whether that's sandboxes, whether that's specific kind of trial programs that you enable. But you have these abilities to almost incubate ideas. And so often that kind of goes to the wayside because it sounds technically difficult or it sounds like a lot of work. But ultimately, that's where a lot of your best innovative ideas are going to come from. And that's also how your innovation is going to scale beyond just like a trend cycle.
I really like the idea of safe experimentation as well. Like I've written that down. It's not something that, we've also talked about, but I think it encompasses a bunch of things, or at least like a mindset that we should have when, adopting. And we should also like see it from the IT leader's perspective and the IT department's perspective before we go off, like, ask them, hey, you're not letting us innovate and doing this and that.
Well, because the sad truth is ultimately they're going to have to clean it up. Whatever you do, whatever goes wrong, it's not going to be you that's there at 2 a.m. resetting a system or re-imaging a disk. It's them. So be kind to your local security and IT leaders.
Be kind to your local IT leaders. Anyway, like that's a campaign we can get behind. Um, so like slightly changing tack here, Hannah, with like as someone who's like deeply embedded in AI strategy, I think we've had guests over uh who are like active CIOs, like taking these decisions every day, but we've probably never had somebody like this much um, um this embedded almost as a scientist in like in like implementing it across. So this is a question I had written down. uh you know how do you see ESM, especially, and IT service management, like more more relevant to us autonomic work, evolving in the next 3 to 5 years? It's the underlying layer of like all IT departments. It's like how they deploy everything. It's how we keep track of everything. It's how we keep track of problems. It's how we keep track of everything in the org, right? How do you see that particular system evolving?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say it might be a hot take, but I would say it's very similar to the rest of the kind of business landscape, which is that you're going from process orchestration to agent orchestration. I think It's not a particularly hot take, but I'm going to call it a hot take for spice. In the next 3 to 5 years, AI agents are going to be at the core of every major technology. Like that's where this is going. And especially because AI made functional is AI made efficient. That's really where you start to see the gains and the return on investment beyond just good data. You're getting results, you're getting action, you're getting real world change and impact. And so I think especially when you're talking about kind of ESM and IT service in general, instead of kind of routing tickets or relying on automation from speed things up perspective, you're going to have intelligent agents capable of resolving requests, collaborating across systems, learning from context. And it's not about taking humans out of something. It's instead about elevating what service teams are doing to be orchestrators rather than the initial task doers. And it changes into a system of kind of agent ecosystems, but the core has to have control, oversight, and trust. Because ultimately, AI adoption happens at the speed of trust. You're never going to scale a system if you don't have that trustworthy center of it. And that's never going to come if you don't have visibility. Trust from a psychological perspective comes through seeing, but it also definitely in computer and IT systems comes through seeing. And also it comes through reliability over time. It's constancy that helps build that kind of trust relationship. So I think, instead of structured workflows and ticketing and SLAs, it's much more going to be about autonomous AI agents that are capable of handling requests, writing code, in some cases, even eventually resolving incidents, helping negotiate access policies. And we're just moving to a world where I think service management becomes more dynamic, intelligent, and self optimizing. And I think the biggest shift will be around those IT leaders, those service leaders, moving from thinking about tasks to thinking about behaviors. I think one of the things that comes through so much in conversations is that you almost always start incrementally with this very small task layer. But once you get to scale, you're talking about entire processes. You're talking about entire systems of behavior, systems of doing that are going to shift because eventually most projections would say that every person will operate a team of AI agents. And so your scale of possibility of what you can achieve in a day, it doesn't just 10x, it 100x's. But that has to come with observability, reliability, and auditability.
Thank you again. I think your one-liners are great, Hannah. I've written a couple of them down again. AI made functional is AI made efficient. Um, I was reading that down, and then there's AI adoption, which this one I really love. AI adoption happens at the speed of trust. I think this is something that we discuss less about. As the more we get our IT leaders and departments to trust the AI, they'll allow us sort of to enjoy it even more and enjoy the technological sort of movements even more. And we haven't, I haven't seen talk about this specific thing. I think you should write about that, and I certainly will. But you should. This is a question I was really looking forward to. What's one thing about like AI adoption or cybersecurity, especially, that most people in the industry still get wrong?
The biggest mistake is probably treating AI agents like applications instead of actors. They reason, they act, they learn. And honestly, you can't think of them as traditional software. You can't think of them as these services that are going to be able to be governed with static controls or with a bunch of guardrails and policies in place by themselves. They are decision makers. And they're not sentient human beings, but they do have delegated decisional authority. The way that I kind of talk about them all the time is like, imagine third party contractors, but they have no context or experience. So they're just coming online to do this series of jobs. You're kind of tech shoring these small series of functions. And instead of treating it like an application where it's predetermined decisions, it's predetermined code, it just executes on a schedule. It's like a Python script. Like there's nothing creative or innovative happening. It's just executing. This is autonomous decision making. This is dynamic and changing decision making. And it's one of the reasons that AI agents are such an interesting space because they're non-deterministic. You can test them 1,000 times, and on the 1,001st time, they'll do something totally different. So I think one of the things I've seen in a lot of discourse, and one of the things that a lot of security and IT leaders have talked about with me is that AI agents are often described as AI applications, and that really can fall short of what it means to implement them in your business and what it means to govern them from a visibility perspective. Because app management is very, very different to human resource management and to human risk management. And it's entirely different in its operational reality as well as its potential to go awry.
This is something that we were discussing just before we hit record, and I sort of wrote that down as well and sort of filed that away. especially because of your psychology background, Hannah. Like, it gives you a slightly different lens on adoption. And you said this just before, when we were talking. You said that we should design AI strategies that work for people. Just not look at systems, though we do look at systems, right? Can you just go deeper into that? I think that's very useful as a framework.
I hope my background in psychology gives me a lot of empathy for security and IT leaders because I understand their operations and I also understand the realities of human behavior. I think, if you think about a core truth. Like technology doesn't succeed in a vacuum. It succeeds in the hands of real people using it day in, day out in the way in which they actually work. I think so often, and I might have said this earlier, we kind of have this illusion that we'll have the perfect user. We always talk about, the user problems that we experience, and there's kind of a rallying cry around the user being the last line of defense and how bad of an idea that is. But the reality is humans are at the core of every system, including businesses. And so the idea that AI adoption is going to somehow happen in this perfect game mentality. We were talking about cricket. Like imagining that every single cricket match is going to be a perfect game would leave your team so underprepared and so subject. I mean, a weather alone, you can't imagine the kind of horrible things that would go wrong. And so when you think about AI systems, we don't think that we're doing this, but we often subconsciously plan for perfect users. We plan for everyone to use it according to acceptable use, there to be no exceptions, no rules that can be bended or moved. And you just can't design AI for that. You have to design AI for how people really work. They work in complicated systems. They're distracted. They have a lot of tasks. They're often overloaded. They're under pressure. And that's where, for me, real AI adoption lives. You have to start there in terms of how your technology is going to be used by users. Beyond just the experience of being able to use AI, which is interesting, what does it shape for them? How does it change their perspective on things? How does it help them to work more efficiently? And you can think about it like, oh, this is a bit humanistic. I don't need to worry that much. Like, they'll just comply because it's a policy. But I promise you, you will have a caution it's hot label within a year of something that you couldn't have conceived of that someone will try to do with the system, that they will do with the system. And so it's that idea of like knowing your people landscape almost, understand who your users are. Because even in a business, I've seen this so many times. Two companies, they're in identical industries, they have identical ICPs, they might work across the street from each other. Their user base is entirely different. The way that they operate, the way that they do business, the way that they structure their thinking is entirely different. And one of the most important things about AI agents specifically is that they make decisions. So the idea that humans have so much cognitive load, you make worse decisions at 5 p.m. You have all these cognitive realities that we don't always think about in terms of the future of work and how we plan for innovation. And so really thinking through, how do I understand human behavior? Because I have to understand system behavior. I have to understand system realities in order to make that work long term. So plan for the users you have, expect the users you have to operate in the systems that they have. And I think also don't wait to surface risk until something goes wrong. Quite often you hear this kind of quiet compliance where there's, if something goes really wrong, it will bubble up, like something will come to the surface. But the realities of human behavior are such that so many things will have gone wrong by then that you'll have a really hard time untying all the things that went wrong. You'll just find the worst thing rather than all the 50 things. And so really think through, like, how do my users actually experience this technology? How are they going to use it? And more importantly, how is it going to add or detract from the system complexity that I already have? Because I already have silos. I already have difficulty getting all my data to where it needs to be and making sure no one can touch it that shouldn't touch it. So, really making sure that you understand that as you adopt AI agents, I think will prepare you to scale.
I love, the answer because I've seen it happen. We deployed our, AI assistant Atom uh, internally first because we're testing it out. And then everybody's, asking it questions and like, hey, where's my pay slip? Bunch of like things that are like really straightforward, task. Hey, can you ask ID to send me a mouse? Right? Stuff like that. And somebody asked something so random, you know, that the AI is like, what? I don't know how to do this, right? And we're all of us are thinking, what are you? And we think that, okay, this should be easier than that. But the thing is that people are people and they'll ask anything. And ours is a play use case because it's like only ITSM, only ASM, and like you think it's straightforward, right? Here's an ITIL framework. Everybody knows what it is. Here's all the modules. Everybody's going to ask these things, but they don't. They ask something random, and the AI is like, "What the hell are you asking?" Right? And or we have to go back and think, okay, like, have we like programmed it well? Like, is it understanding it, and so on. So like, I get what you're saying.
One of my co-founders is super into Star Trek, so I always think of like the logical problem. But so often, IT and security are such logic centers. Like, if business were a brain, they would be the logic center. They would be like, this is the way things should go. A bunch of engineers get together and say, right, this is the solution to the problem. Obviously, this is how we solve it. And then the rest of the business comes in with their completely different and creative ways to do things. And they're like, how did you even try to order a pizza through the IT service management? Like, why would you think that well, it said services, so I just thought of services. And so it's planning for human curiosity and also for things to go slightly left of what you think it's going to work from a logical perspective.
Hannah, like, having moved from like, especially cybersecurity and threat sort of research to now product leadership, right? Um, like how do you ensure that AI capabilities are tied to business outcomes? I think we hit that slightly in one of our earlier questions, right? Because now, from product leadership, it's a particular vantage point. You also have to show, okay, so there's ROI on this and there's like business outcomes on this, and you also have to think, okay, is the AI ready? And like, is it in a place where I'm happy deploying it across the product? So it's a very very my head of our head of product would really love this answer, so I wrote that question down for her. Especially during large scale transformation efforts, right? How do you like balance that?
I mean, I think one of the clearest lessons for me, shifting from threat research to kind of product leadership is that technical excellence only gets you so far. It doesn't mean anything if it doesn't map to real business outcomes. So often you build this really shiny, cool thing, and it's a really shiny, cool thing, and it does all this really cool stuff. But if it doesn't actually move the bottom line for the business, if it doesn't actually provide a real world outcome for the business, it just gets lost in the shuffle. So I think one of the key things is, technical excellence is great, but it doesn't really help you long term if it doesn't map to business outcomes. And also, especially in AI, it's so easy to get caught up in models and benchmarks and agent capabilities. But when you're talking about like large scale digital transformation, if it doesn't clearly support how the business reduces a risk, creates a value, accelerates execution, it's just not going to work long term. It's going to be something that happened in the mid short term and then kind of patters out and attenuates. I think you have to start by asking, what is the actual outcome the business needs? Is it faster decision making? Is it lower operational risk? And then you have to think through designing around those needs. It's almost like outcome based design. It's so often not as much about the functionality. The functionality supports the outcome. And sometimes, products, we love a function, we love a feature, we love a thing that you couldn't do before. But if it doesn't, again, solve a real problem, if it doesn't map to a business outcome, it doesn't necessarily have longevity. And I think it also has to have a lot of line of sight into how that really works in the business. So, for example, are you reducing cognitive load? So, do your teams have to work less hard mentally to get to an outcome? Is it surfacing risk faster? Is it helping leaders make more confident decisions? What are those business outcomes? Um, I think something that is really true in product is, no matter how cool the thing you built is, if it doesn't solve a problem, it's not going to work long term.
Okay, that's a great answer. And that's going to come up on the blog I do, about a conversation as well. Um, Thank you so much, Hannah. Like, I enjoyed this conversation so much. I think I've learned a lot more, and I work in an AI product. Like, I've learned a lot more about like, governance, about security, and about like a simple frameworks to think about how, we adopt and like how we want our product, to be adopted. I'm really happy with this conversation. I'm pretty sure we're going to get a bunch of like questions to you, again, and we'll probably bring you back on at some point again. We'd love
Right.
to have
I'd love
you.
it.
Thank you, and that's it for today from us. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Thank you for your time. It was lovely to be here.